Thanks for joining us tonight on another episode of The Racing Report. My name is Rob Peeters, and I am your host once again for another fabulous little half hour where we're going to talk all things motorsports. And let me tell you something, there might not have been a lot of racing in action this past weekend, but there's no shortage of news that has been released since we last talked. Of course, we did have IMSA up in Road America. That was a very exciting and quite controversial race. And then also we had Supercars in Perth at Wanneroo, which could be one of the last times that series goes to that track with the new racetrack in Perth coming up, and it's set to open here in another year's time. So lots to talk about this week, no shortage of it. Let's go ahead and jump right on in, and we'll begin today, as always, with the news out of the world of Formula One, because Formula One is now on their summer break, which means that things are going to be a little bit light in that regard. But here's something that's interesting, and it piggybacks off of something that we talked about last week. So last week we discussed the fact that Formula One is going to go back to Malaysia. Of course, it's going to be a replacement for the Bahrain Grand Prix. It's going to be called the Bahrain Grand Prix in Malaysia. It's going to take place at the Sepang International Circuit, and Pirelli gave some insight into how they are preparing for F1's return to that circuit. The series now, remember, hasn't raced there since 2017, but for Pirelli, that's actually a good thing because that was the first year where they had a little bit of a wider tire. That was the first year where they kind of changed up those regulations from when you had a much more narrow-ish, I guess, type of car with a very high rear wing, those kind of regulations that had been in Formula One since about 2009. Those were phased out. The car was made sleeker, wider, so were the tires as well. And so that kind of works out in Pirelli's favor because the cars still kind of look like that, still kind of hold the same kind of idea. And so the tires aren't really going to be that different. So when they came to Malaysia the last time, like I said, in 2017, they brought what is currently the equivalent to the C2, C3, and C4 tires. So expect that to possibly be what Pirelli goes with again. And so it looks like it's not going to be as much of a challenge, but there was something interesting here. Pirelli Motorsport Director Dario Marafushi said that the company needs at least 7 weeks' notice in order to be ready for any addition of a European Grand Prix to the Formula One schedule in the event that the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix cannot take place. So that's something we'll need to be looking for if Formula One's going to make a decision on the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. They have to give Pirelli at least a 7 weeks notice so that they could be ready for whatever tire they need to bring to whatever replacement round it is, especially if it's in Europe in December. You're going to get very, very cold temperatures, and Pirelli's going to have to navigate that. So just something we'll have to keep in mind going forward as this new Formula One schedule kind of ebbs and flows with where we're going, whether or not we're going to the Middle East and Abu Dhabi or not. Something else in the world of Formula One to discuss this week. Red Bull team principal Laurent Mekies said that the team's upgrades that have come since the opening race in Melbourne have eaten substantially into the team's budget cap, and that now the team intends to shift their focus to the 2027 car a lot earlier than last year. This is, again, because of that cost cap. Formula One teams are trying to be better with adhering to that cost cap, especially since a lot of them have broken it in previous seasons. But we'll see what Red Bull ends up doing. Obviously, they have made great gains, but they're not going to be making possibly as big of gains as the season rolls on. We'll probably see them go into next year with likely a stronger car, as they talked about in this same article, how their development of last year's car, how they were developing it so late, actually put them a little bit behind the 8 ball going into 2026. So hopefully they're looking to avoid that for 2027. Carlos Sainz recently appeared on a podcast in which he revealed his strong desire to run the 24 Hours of Le Mans when he eventually retires from Formula One. Sainz, of course, has no plans right now to retire from Formula One in the near future, but he is talking about what the future does hold for him when eventually that time comes. And he also mentioned how much fun he thinks it would be to run some GT3 races as well. So we might get a little bit more of an insight into that. Be very cool, possibly one day down the road, to see Carlos Sainz running at Le Mans. Final piece of Formula One news here real quick before we move on. Circuit of the Americas chairman Bobby Epstein told Racer that the United States Grand Prix tickets are on pace for a record crowd. Ticket sales are on pace for a record crowd. He said that the demand for tickets could, quote, easily break our prior year record. So that's great news for the United States Grand Prix. Great news for Circuit of the Americas. Great news for Austin, Texas. Great news for pretty much everybody involved in that event and putting on that race. Hopefully it's another great crowd, and it looks like these new regulations are not deterring anybody from buying tickets to the USGP coming up here in a couple of months' time. On that note, let's go ahead and move on into the world of IndyCar, because last week I mentioned that at the time we didn't know when the new IR28 chassis was going to make its on-track debut. Well, of course, as happens, shortly after I recorded this episode, IndyCar announced that they were going to hold open tests over the course of this most recent weekend. So we did get to see a first look and listen to this new car. It was honestly a fairly decent event, I think. A lot of people came out to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway on those viewing mounds to see the car tested, to see the car in person. Of course, Alexander Rossi got behind the wheel of the car first, and then Alex Palou took over a couple of days later. So it's very interesting to see the positive feedback as well. Both Rossi and Palou gave glowing reviews to the chassis with a lot of positive things to be said. And also something that was kind of neat also that I liked was when there was some rain, of course, this weekend in Indianapolis, and when Palou was doing a run in the wet, you could kind of see, based on where the rain and where the water flew up over the car, how that air is going to kind of be manipulated to hopefully make for some closer racing, hopefully prevent any dirty air, and maybe make for a lot more passing at certain racetracks. So that's a good thing in general. Looks like IndyCar's got something really good for them coming up here in a couple of years when they finally debut the IR28 in 2028. Something else, let's talk about this. The race distance for the upcoming Freedom 250 Grand Prix has been extended, and it will now be a true 250-mile race. The original distance was scheduled to be 125 laps, or a total of 212 and a half miles. The race will now be 147 laps long, which is the equivalent of 250 miles almost exactly along that 1.7 mile street course. So that is something to keep in mind. It's going to be a long day if you are in Washington, D.C. If you are planning to watch this race, be prepared. It's going to be a long one. But hey, at least the tickets were free, right? Final piece of IndyCar news here before we move on real quick. IndyCar will indeed return to Phoenix Raceway during the NASCAR weekend on March 13th. Phoenix Raceway, and this is something we'll talk about coming up after the break. Phoenix Raceway, along with a number of other NASCAR tracks, have officially announced their schedules. So last week we talked about the Craftsman Truck Series once again returning to St. Petersburg in a combination race with IndyCar. Well, now again, IndyCar is going to do a combination race with the Cup Series and the O'Reilly Auto Parts Series and the ARCA Series as well, coming up next March at the Phoenix Raceway. So great to see that event coming back again. I know it was a big success for the track, for IndyCar, for NASCAR, everybody involved this year. So hopefully they'll be able to recreate that coming up next year. Now, before we move on, and before we take our first break, let's go ahead. We've got some Formula E news to talk about, because we've got some calendar changes. Formula One's changing its calendar. Now Formula E's following suit. But Formula E's got a little bit more of a reasonable reason for why they've changed their calendar. So they've moved the Monaco E-Prix in order to avoid a clash with the 6 hours of Spa. That's a WEC race. Now, if you're not familiar really with either of those series, that's okay. Don't worry about it. I'll explain why this is a big deal. A lot of drivers who compete in Formula E also compete in the WEC. So it's not a good idea to force most of your drivers in your series to have to choose between one or the other when they're typically have no problems doing both. The WEC doesn't run very often. It does run about 6 to 7 races per year, whereas Formula E has significantly more than that. But still, Formula E races take place maybe once or twice every month. It's a lot easier to work around your schedule that way in order to do both racing series. And so the series is working to avoid that clash. So what they've done is the Monaco Grand Prix, was originally scheduled for May 15th and 16th, but that has now been moved to May 1st and 2nd of 2027. So that avoids the clash with the 6 hours of Spa, which is, I think, a great thing for everybody. But on that note, let's go ahead and take our first break of the show. Because actually, that's not the first break of the show. Excuse me. I still got one more thing to talk about Formula E, and this is a big deal. I spoke too soon, and I read my cue cards wrong. Théo Pourchaire is coming back to full-time open-wheel racing after winning the Formula 2 title in 2023. Pourchaire will join Opel in 2027 and is expected to be partnered alongside Mitch Evans, who previously announced his departure from Jaguar at season's end. That's the actual last piece of Formula E news. Now let's take our first break of the show, because when we come back, we're going to discuss some brief news in the world of supercars, and then, like I said, talk about some of those NASCAR schedule dates that we know now, but why we'll also talk about why we haven't gotten the full NASCAR Cup Series, O'Reilly Auto Parts Series, or Truck Series schedule for next year coming up after this break. So, more Racing Report coming up next. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Racing Report. My name is Rob Peeters. Thanks again so much for sticking with us through that break. Sorry, I was a little bit premature in hyping up that break, but now we're back. Let's avoid all of that, and let's not do that again. Let's talk about the news in the world of supercars. Lots to get to real quick. This was the biggest thing, though, I think that's very interesting. AAA Racing says it is putting Will Brown in the team's spare chassis ahead of the Ipswich Super 440 in 2 weeks' time. Now, this comes on the heels of some disappointing races out of Will Brown, not just on track during the race itself, but also in qualifying. They'd like to see Brown be able to get back up on par with Brock Feeney, and that has not been something that has happened very recently. Now, we all know Will Brown is a perfectly capable driver. He's a perfectly talented driver. He's won plenty of supercars races in the past, though maybe not as many as Brock Feeney. But regardless, I think this is a very substantial move for AAA Racing to kind of admit defeat on one car and say, we're going to throw something else out here and see if this can help Brown get back up to where he needs to be and competing for race wins and competing for race podiums again, as well as pole positions. And I hope, for his sake, this is something that will work out in the long run. But again, we've got a couple of weeks here before we get to Ipswich, and then we'll kind of get seeing what exactly this new chassis is going to bring for Will Brown. Next piece of Supercars news. Adelaide event organizers say they are bringing back the $50,000 prize for the winner of the Friday race during the Adelaide Grand Final weekend. So again, this is something they did last year. They're going to bring it back again this year because they want to give the drivers not competing for the championship an opportunity to still have a vested interest in winning. And so going out there and saying the Friday race, we're going to have $50,000 on the line for you. I think that's a great way to do it. So very, very excited to see who wins that Friday race and what kind of championship implications perhaps it brings when we get down to it coming up in several months' time. Finally, let's talk about some positive Supercars news. Not to say that those other two weren't positive, but this is very positive for the series, that they say that this past weekend's Perth Super 440 saw its highest attendance levels in 10 years with a reported 3-day crowd of 40,213 people. That's a 15% year-over-year increase for the event. Great news there. And of course, let's not forget, it is likely the penultimate race there, as they do have the Perth Park circuit set to open up for 2028. So possibly you had a lot of people out there at Western Australia coming out and trying to enjoy as much time watching supercars races at Wanneroo as possible. Now we're going to go ahead quickly, and we've got some IMSA news to talk about. We don't really talk about IMSA that much, and I'm sorry, that's my fault. And in fact, it's more my fault. I was so busy trying to finish up the script for last week's show, I forgot to even tease the Road America race this weekend in IMSA, and I apologize for that. But let's go ahead and get into some news real quick, because Racer is reporting that IMSA president John Doonan says that he and his team are actively looking to add new markets to the schedule as early as 2028. Now, no specific tracks were mentioned by Doonan during this interview, but definitely a very interesting way to get some discussions rolling. Very curious to see what some of those new markets could be and what they end up eventually settling on by 2028. Very curious to see where this goes for the series. And then we've got to get into some sad and kind of upsetting and sad news. Nobody died, but Pfaff Motorsports, the Canadian GTD Pro team known for its plaid liveries, is expected to scale back its racing operations and withdraw from the WeatherTech Sports Car Series at season's end. Unfortunately, this decision was reportedly made last month, with the team being informed of the news just this past Monday. So some very disappointing news if you're a Canadian fan of the Sports Car Series, and if you are a fan of Pfaff Motorsports. They are going away at the end of the season. It was also teased on the NBC Peacock broadcast over the past weekend when they were at Road America. So again, that wasn't really a shock when we actually finally got the news, but still it is kind of upsetting and honestly just kind of sad and depressing to see another team closing up shop. But, looks like that team is not necessarily going away. The future, whatever the future holds, is still up in the air. So we'll see. Maybe they come back in the future. Who knows? Now let's go ahead and we got to get to some NASCAR news, because this is big. We got some schedule news primarily to talk about. Now, remember, the schedule for NASCAR is not out, but we had one major domino fall this past week, and that is that NASCAR is moving the Clash officially back to the Daytona Oval. This event will be held Saturday night, February 13th, and will be called the Wheatley Vodka Clash at Daytona, after Wheatley Vodka signed a new multi-year agreement to become the official vodka of NASCAR. Now, Daytona says the Clash will kick off Speed Week on Saturday night, with qualifying following the next Wednesday, and then the duels will be on Thursday, of course, the truck race Friday, O'Reilly race on Saturday, and finally the Daytona 500 on Sunday. Now, again, NASCAR has not released its 2027 schedule, and it is believed that the hang-up for that is due to negotiations and trying to figure out what they're going to do with both the San Diego race at the Coronado Naval Base and then the Chicago Street Course. Of course, we talked about last week that has kind of hit a stall. NASCAR is not exactly certain what they're going to do or how they're going to get that to happen, and it's likely that it will be one race or the other. Either they go back to the street race or they go back to Chicagoland. Jordan Bianchi of The Athletic is reporting that it is very unlikely that the two races will coexist on the calendar at any given time. So definitely that's one of the biggest hangups. But here's what we've got right now. Here's what we know right now of the 2027 NASCAR schedule. Of course, it will start, like I said, February 13th with the Clash at Daytona, and then we'll have the Daytona 500 on February 21st. The next week after that, February 28th, they'll go to Atlanta Motor Speedway. So it's again going to be Daytona and then Atlanta to kick off the season. Sunday, March 7th, Circuit of the Americas is coming back to the NASCAR schedule. We've got that date now formally announced. Then, of course, in addition to the IndyCar race being announced to returning to Phoenix Raceway, they also announced the dates for their NASCAR races as well. Phoenix Raceway will host its first Cup date on Sunday, March 14th. Then Sunday, May 2nd is the next race that we've got confirmed so far. That's going to be at Texas Motor Speedway. And then, of course, we already knew Atlanta had announced its dates. So we know the next Atlanta race is going to, of course, be on July 18th. Then, of course, the second Daytona race, August 28th, with the second and final Phoenix race set for October 24th. Now, of course, we don't know exactly. We haven't had, well, I should say we don't know exactly. We haven't had Charlotte Motor Speedway announce their schedules yet, but we already know that the Coca-Cola 600 will take place the Sunday before Memorial Day. We already know that. We already kind of know that. We know when the Indy 500 will be. Then we, by default, know when the Coca-Cola 600 will be. So that's the only one that we kind of already know, but we don't have confirmed yet. But what I've just said are the dates that we do have confirmed for NASCAR's Cup schedule for 2027. Everything else, like I said, remains kind of TBD right now. The one last thing we're going to talk about schedule-wise on that front is that NASCAR expects, it should be expected that the championship race will once again return to the Homestead Miami Speedway for 2027. NASCAR not really planning on changing that just yet, even though we did talk about, and they did say that they expected to rotate this championship race. Looks like that rotation's not going to start just yet. It's going to do another year at Homestead before maybe it starts rotating in 2028. I don't know. Take that with a grain of salt. We'll see. Two more pieces of NASCAR news we got to talk about. First of all, coming out of the O'Reilly Auto Parts Series, Carson Brown, a current Richard Childress Racing development driver, will make his O'Reilly Auto Parts Series debut this weekend at Iowa, driving the number 32 for Jordan Anderson Racing. And then Tristan McKee will make his Truck Series debut in 2 weeks' time at the Richmond Raceway, driving the number 77 for Spire Motorsports. Now, he turned 16 on August 3rd. That was Monday, meaning he is now eligible to compete in road courses and short tracks in the Craftsman Truck Series. Remember, he's been doing quite well in the ARCA Menards Series so far this year, so good to see him getting up and doing truck races now that he is officially eligible via his turning 16. All right, that is it for the news. Let's go ahead and take our second and final break, and I promise I don't have any more news, unlike the last time. We're going to take our second and final break, and then when we come back, we're going to recap the few races that we had in action this past weekend, and then we're going to get you ready for all of the races coming up this weekend. Lots to look forward to, and you're not going to want to miss that segment. So, more Racing Report coming up after this. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Racing Report. My name is Rob Peeters. Thanks again so much for sticking with us through that break. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the races that happened most recently this past weekend. Of course, as I mentioned, I did forget to mention this last week when we took a look at the races that are coming up this weekend. I forgot to mention that there was an IMSA race at Road America. I do apologize for that. Please forgive me. But let's talk a little bit about it because it was quite controversial, to say the least. Of course, a lot of crashes in LMP2, which caused a lot of frustration and some funny moments on Twitter. And then, of course, you had the 31 car at the getting involved in some controversies as well. There's apparently, I wouldn't call it a powder keg, but some unhappy and frustrated people in the IMSA paddock right now. But on the bright side of that, Wayne Taylor Racing finally broke their winless streak by winning in GTP class. That was with drivers Felipe Albuquerque and then Ricky Taylor. In LMP2, Inter Europol were the winners there. Tom Dillman, Bioy Garg, and Jeremy Clark were the drivers. In GTD Pro, a great way to send them off, I guess, is winning a race in your final season. Pfaff Motorsports getting it done with Andrea Caldarelli and Sandy Mitchell. And then in GTD, Windward Racing won with Russell Ward, Indy Dante, and Philip Ellis. That is your recap in the world of IMSA. Let's talk about real quick now what happened in the world of Supercars at Wanneroo. Matt Payne scoring a dub in race 1, followed by Brock Feeney getting it done in race 2, and then Matt Payne finishing it up again, wrapping things up with a dub in race 3. Again, if you wondered why Team 18 wants Matt Payne so gosh darn badly, you just have to watch this weekend and you'll see exactly why. Of course, no shortage of controversy on and off the track. Again, in Supercars, they just seem to be having quite a lot of that. A lot of driving standards, I think, need to get worked on down there. But that was really all we had in store for you this past weekend. There was no NASCAR, no IndyCar, no Formula One. Nothing. Really, just those races. There were some grassroots races, of course, but we don't usually cover those in the weekend recap, but we will talk about the grassroots races that are coming up this weekend. And let's take a look at those races that are this weekend. First of all, we got NASCAR going to Iowa Speedway. The O'Reilly Series Auto Parts Series race kicks things off on the NASCAR side Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on the CW, with the Cup Series finishing things up Sunday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time on USA. Of course, the ARCA National Series, they kick that weekend off entirely on Friday, coming up at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on FS1. IndyCar is in Portland this weekend as well. Indy Next will race on Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on FS1, with the IndyCar race following Sunday at 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time on Fox. MotoGP is in Silverstone this weekend. That race will take place Sunday at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time on FS1. ARCA West is in action over in Portland with the IndyCar Series. They'll race Saturday at 8:45 p.m. Eastern Time. Of course, you can catch that on Flow Racing. The Cars Tour will race at Hickory. They're coming up this weekend, Saturday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Flow Racing. And then we got World of Outlaws coming up this weekend at Federated Auto Parts I-55 Raceway Park. They'll start Friday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and then again Saturday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Both of those races can be watched on Dirt Vision. So, how about that for this weekend's racing? How about that for last weekend's racing? How about that for the news? That's all we got for you this week on the Racing Report, but don't worry, we're going to have another episode next week. You catch us every single week right here on the WTHR streaming app, and also, while you're here, make sure you're subscribed to YouTube, to WTHR on YouTube, and if you are watching on YouTube, let me know down in the comments what kind of race you would like to see IMSA, what kind of market you'd like to see IMSA race at in 2028. That'd be very cool. But also, if you like this show, remember, follow me on social media. You could do so by looking up at rpeters33 on whatever site you prefer to use, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, have fun, whatever you want to do. That is it for this week's episode of the Racing Report. Thanks again so much for watching. And for WTHR, my name is Rob Peeters, and this has been the Racing Report.